When Tucker Carlson was interviewing Vladimir Putin in Moscow, I think a lot of people were expecting a historic interview, but not so many people were expecting an interview that was so much about history. And I don't think even Tucker Carlson was expecting it. He certainly seemed to have some difficulties absorbing it all during the interview, and he commented in his introduction to the interview that he initially thought it was all just a filibustering technique, and still I don't think quite understood the significance of all the history of that Vladimir Putin talked about in the interview, the history of Russia, the history of Ukraine, and the history of the tensions between, America and Russia over the last 30 odd years. And at times, I guess Tucker Carlson displayed some impatience with it all, and I think maybe a lot of viewers might have felt, I'm not going to listen to 2 hours of Vladimir Putin talking about, Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise and what happened in 1654 with Khmelnytsky and other sorts of issues. But in fact, the history is actually really fundamental to the story that was told in that interview. And you're welcome to disagree with it, but I think it is important to try to respect and understand it. So because I do try to, understand the history that still informs the present on this channel, the Burning Archive channel. My name's Jeff Rich. I thought I'd do a quick video trying to just give a bit of a framing for the discussion of history in this interview with Vladimir Putin, so perhaps it becomes a little bit more accessible to more people, which it clearly wasn't entirely accessible to Tucker Carlson. The interview itself, I think, really breaks down into 4. So the first part of that interview is a long discussion of the historical development of Russia, of Ukraine, and the social, political, cultural identities of Russia, Ukraine, and the other peoples who, live within the boundaries of the Russian state. The second part of the interview is really about, the last 30 years of conflict, tension of NATO between NATO and Russia, and really the choice NATO and America made not to make an enduring peace after 1991, but to continue the conflict and ultimately to bring the conflict to Russia's doorstep in Ukraine, particularly with the coup in 2014 that was discussed extensively. And then the third part of the interview is really more around the peace process and the current state of the war, both specifically in Ukraine, but more broadly in terms of the economic war between Russia and the United States and its NATO partners. And then the final part of the interview is, a broader set of reflections around the multipolar world, the changing world, how well America is adapting to the world, and the extent to which it's in Russia's hands or America's hands to open peace negotiations. So really, I just want to kind of focus in on that first part of the interview, the history, a lot of which might be unfamiliar to people not familiar with Russian history, but is actually really crucial to it, and to try to maybe cut through to one particular point in the interview where the relevance of all that discussion in the interview really comes out. That point is at the 23 minute and 45 second timestamp in the interview, where Vladimir Putin talks about the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union and the set of decisions that were made at that point. And he makes the point then that this is a very important point. And there's really, it's the point at which, I guess, all those issues I talked about, the formation of Ukraine, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, the conflict between the US and the new Russian Federation, the historical development of the related Russian and Ukrainian identities under multiple regimes, including under the Soviet Union. It all comes together, and it's this pivotal moment in history where, if you like, the leaders of the West and the leaders of Russia, perhaps, and the leaders of Ukraine could have taken a different path, but in the end began, I guess, the path to a war that has now broken out tragically in Ukraine and maybe at some point will be brought to an end. Because it's at this point that, if you like, the West decides not to embrace the new post-communist, post-socialist, post-Union of Soviet Socialist Republic Russia, and the other post-Soviet state doesn't embrace them as part of a new multipolar civilized world. It puts up the cold shoulder to Russia and keeps that cold shoulder up for ever since. And it's at that point that Ukraine starts to try, finally, actually, really for the first time in its history, forms itself as an independent state and starts to actually make its political elites need to make its own decisions about how to form itself as a independent national state. And it's also, I guess, the point at which the choices are made as to whether to stick with the long development of the interwoven language, family ties, culture, history, faith, state, economies, all these, what Vladimir Putin described as the assumed fundamentals, the fundamentals of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, that in 1991 meant that although they were worried about the whole NATO thing, they kind of never really imagined that NATO would bring a war to their doorstep in Ukraine because of all these interconnected things. So it's this point in 1991 which is so critical to the story, where if you like, the long history all the way back to Kievan Rus and Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise sort of comes together with the story of the fractious nature of Ukrainian identity under both the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, how they all sort of came together at this crisis point, and various actors slowly, progressively started to take a different way. So there's really four strands of the story that come together in this point. The long historical development of assumed common fundamental relationships between Russia and Ukraine, which the Russians assumed would always be there, and to some degree they are assuming now will ultimately return and be healed by time. The fateful choice of how, as Richard Sackwar said, the West failed to prevent a second Cold War by refusing to embrace Russia as part of a genuinely, I guess, equitable international system after the end of the Cold War. The particular legacy of the complex development of the Ukrainian state under the Soviet Union, and the way in which that actually made the crisis of 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, so difficult, and, if you like, planted a time bomb of this sort of, a time bomb of nationalism that separated peoples who had lots of other kinds of social connections, and created a kind of this is what Putin means by Ukraine being an artificial state. And then finally, I guess, America's and NATO's fateful decision to begin, I guess, a long war of choice against Russia in 1991. And the story of that is brilliantly told in Richard Sackwar's book, The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. And it's in a different sort of way also told in the excellent book by Emmanuel Todd, The Defeat of the West. Now, the defeat of the West is a response to Russia-Ukraine war. It's in a way a complex historical book. It's only available in French at the moment, but I've done an introduction to that book that is actually tells you about the 10 surprises, the 10 important surprises of the Russia-Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine, which suggest, as the 10th of which is, as Emmanuel Todd says, the West is facing defeat. And you can watch that video right here. And thanks for watching this video. I hope it's given you a bit of a better insight into Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin.